The most powerful army in Europe was terrified of him. Kings negotiated with him. Emperors wrote him letters. The crowned heads of a continent that had spent centuries perfecting the theater of royal power watched this man remake the world and could not stop him. And history remembered him as small. Not small in ambition, not small in legacy, small in the way that ends conversations before they begin, small in the way that makes people smile knowingly before you finish the sentence, small in the way that has its own psychological diagnosis, its own bobblehead, its own Halloween costume. Here is what history forgot to mention. It was a lie. Not a mistake buried in an obscure archive. Not a nuance lost in academic debate. A measurable, documentable, arithmetically provable lie. Built by a cartoonist on a government payroll, carried across 2 centuries by people who never thought to check, and so completely absorbed into Western culture that it now masquerades as common sense. Napoleon Bonaparte was not short. And the story of how the world came to believe he was, that story says far less about one French emperor than it does about all of us. The answer changes everything we thought we understood about Napoleon. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile on the island of Saint Helena. His autopsy was performed by his personal physician, Francesco Antomarchi, and independently verified by a British doctor present at the scene. The record was clear. Napoleon measured 5 feet 6 inches tall. 5 feet 6. That was not short. Not for 1821. That was, by every historical measure available, exactly average for a French male of his era. In some records, it placed him slightly above the mean. The document exists. It has always existed.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
It sits in the historical record, unremarkable, unambiguous, and almost entirely ignored. And yet, for 2 centuries, the world has called him a small man. Not metaphorically small, physically small. The kind of small that gets its own psychological diagnosis. The kind of small that becomes the punchline before anyone even finishes the sentence. 5 feet 6 inches. Nobody questioned this. For over 100 years, nobody questioned this. So here is what that means. Either every historian who ever touched this subject missed a document that was never hidden, or the story of Napoleon's height was never really about his height at all. The official version sounds convincing, until you read what they left out. Ask anyone, anywhere. Walk into a classroom, a bar, a museum gift shop with a Napoleon bobblehead on the shelf, and ask. They will tell you the same thing. Napoleon Bonaparte was short. It is one of those facts that does not require a source. It does not require a textbook or a documentary or even a conversation. It arrives pre-installed, somewhere between learning to read and learning that the Earth orbits the Sun. A piece of common knowledge so settled that questioning it feels slightly embarrassing, like asking whether the sky is blue or whether Rome fell. And the story that comes with it is just as familiar. A young man from Corsica, an outsider, an island boy who spoke French with an accent thick enough to draw mockery at military school. A man who compensated for everything he lacked in stature by accumulating everything he could in power. Armies, empires, crowns. He didn't just want to win wars, he needed to. Because somewhere underneath the general's coat and the bicorn hat was a small, insecure man who had something to prove. That is the version Hollywood gave us. That is the version comedy sketches have repeated for 200 years. That is the version that turned his name into a clinical term, the Napoleon Complex, used by psychologists and lay people alike to describe any short man who overreaches, who dominates, who refuses to accept the limits that his body supposedly imposed on him. It is a compelling story, psychologically satisfying, narratively clean. On the surface, it makes sense. But surfaces are rarely the whole story. Because here is what the official version never quite explains. How did a man so crippled by insecurity become the most effective military commander in modern European history? How did soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them, many far taller than their general, follow this man into the freezing hell of Russian winter without question? How did the crowned heads of Europe, emperors and kings who had spent lifetimes projecting power through physical presence and royal ceremony, spend 20 years genuinely terrified of him? Insecure men do not usually manage that. But the story is too useful to examine too closely. It reduces one of history's most complex and dangerous figures into something manageable, something almost comic. A small man with a big hat and bigger ambitions. A cautionary tale about ego, not a serious study of power. And that reduction, that convenient, enduring, culturally embedded reduction, did not happen by accident. What happened next was not an accident. The myth had architects. It had a purpose. And it was built so well that it outlasted the man himself by 2 full centuries and counting. Everything in that story is technically true, but technically true is not the same as honest. In 1803, a British cartoonist named James Gillray published an illustration that would quietly become one of the most destructive weapons ever deployed against a sitting head of state. The image showed Napoleon, tiny, furious, red-faced, being held by the collar by a giant William Pitt, Britain's prime minister, as the 2 men squabbled over a plum pudding shaped like the globe. Pitt was drawn tall, composed, almost amused. Napoleon was drawn as something closer to a toddler having a tantrum. Boots too big for his feet, hat swallowing his head, face contorted with rage at a world that refused to take him seriously. The cartoon was called Plum Pudding in Danger. It was not the first caricature Gillray had drawn of Napoleon. It would not be the last. But it was the one that crystallized the image, the one that burned itself into the European imagination and never quite left. There is a reason this detail was removed from the official record. Here is what that record actually shows. Napoleon stood, by the measurement taken at his autopsy, 5 feet 2 inches in French units, specifically in pieds and pouces, the imperial system used in France before metrification. When that number crossed the English Channel, something went wrong. French pouces and English inches are not the same unit. A French pouce is slightly longer than an English inch. 5 feet 2 in French units converts to approximately 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 in English inches. The conversion was never made, or rather, it was never corrected. The number 5'2" landed in Britain and was read as 5 feet 2 inches, English Standard. And 5 feet 2 in English inches was genuinely short, below average, small enough to notice in a crowd, small enough to mention. The numbers do not lie. The interpretation does. This was not a deliberate falsification in the way a forged document is a deliberate falsification. It may have begun.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Begun as an honest error, a unit misread across a linguistic and cultural border. But Britain was at war with France. Britain was at war with Napoleon specifically. And a mistake that made the enemy look ridiculous was not a mistake anyone in London was rushing to correct. Gillray understood his audience. He understood that the image of a small, furious Napoleon was not just funny, it was useful. It reframed the most dangerous military mind in Europe as a figure of mockery. A man to be laughed at, not feared. And laughter, in wartime, is a weapon as powerful as any rifle. The British government knew this. There is substantial evidence that Gillray received direct financial support from the British Foreign Office, that his cartoons were not merely tolerated as satire, but actively encouraged as propaganda. This is the part that historians disagree on, and why that disagreement matters. Because if the height myth began as an error and was sustained as strategy, then what we inherited is not a misunderstanding. It is the longest-running psychological operation in modern Western history. A campaign launched during wartime that outlived the war, outlived the warrior, and embedded itself so completely into popular culture that it became indistinguishable from fact. And the most remarkable part? It worked on people who had never heard of James Gillray. It worked on people born 100 years after Napoleon died. It is working right now, in this moment, on millions of people who have never thought about French unit conversions or British wartime propaganda in their lives. That is how good the architecture was. 3 pieces of evidence. Each one alone is interesting. Together, they are impossible to ignore. The first piece of evidence comes from the people who actually stood next to him. Not cartoonists, not British journalists writing dispatches from across the channel. The people who were in the room. The people who shared meals with him, rode beside him on campaign, stood at attention while he reviewed their units in the field. Their accounts are consistent, and they tell a completely different story. Thibault, a French general who served under Napoleon for years, described his commander as a man of commanding physical presence. Not towering, but present. The kind of man whose entrance changed the atmosphere of a room. His personal secretary, Bourrienne, who knew Napoleon from their shared days at military school in Brienne, wrote that he was of medium height, well-proportioned, and carried himself with an authority that made his stature irrelevant. Even his enemies said so. Lord Ebrington, a British nobleman who met Napoleon during his first exile on Elbe in 1814, recorded his impression in a letter that still exists. He noted that Napoleon was, and these are his words filtered through translation, of middling height, and that the stories of his smallness had clearly been exaggerated. A British aristocrat, writing from Elba in 1814, saying the height story was exaggerated. Keep that in mind. We will come back to it. The BBC, in a documented historical review of Napoleonic-era records, confirmed what these first-hand accounts suggest, that Napoleon's height, measured in the units of his own country, placed him squarely within the normal range for French men of his generation. The myth, the review concluded, was a product of mistranslation, compounded by wartime caricature. One witness, one enemy witness, one media institution 2 centuries later, all saying the same thing. And this is where it gets interesting. Napoleon was not unaware of the cartoons. He was not isolated from British propaganda by the fog of war. He saw Gillray's work. He knew exactly what image was being constructed of him across the channel, and his reaction to it tells us something important. He was furious, not indifferent, not dismissive in the way a genuinely secure man might wave away a caricature. According to accounts from his inner circle, the British cartoons, Gillray's in particular, were among the few things that could genuinely destabilize Napoleon's composure. A man who dictated terms to emperors, who redesigned the legal code of an entire civilization, who managed the logistics of armies moving across 5 countries simultaneously, undone, at least partially, by ink on paper. Why does that matter? Because it tells us the propaganda was working in reverse as well. Napoleon understood that the image being projected of him in Britain was shaping how Europe perceived him. Not his battlefield record, not his administrative reforms, not the Napoleonic Code, which restructured law across the continent and whose influence persists to this day. The cartoon. The tiny, furious man in the oversized hat. Smithsonian Magazine, in a detailed analysis of Napoleonic propaganda and its legacy, noted that Gillray's caricatures were among the most politically effective images produced during the Napoleonic Wars, that they functioned less as commentary and more as active instruments of delegitimization. The goal was not to make the British public laugh. The goal was to make the British public, and by extension Europe, incapable of taking Napoleon seriously as a peer. This single decision changed everything that followed. Because once the image was set, once the cartoon became the shorthand, it became almost impossible to dislodge. Every serious military victory Napoleon achieved had to fight its way past the mental image of a small, ridiculous man. Every diplomatic move he made was filtered through that same lens. The propaganda did not need to be believed consciously. It only needed to be present. Here is the part that should stop you completely. The term Napoleon Complex, the psychological concept used to describe overcompensating behavior in short men, was not coined by Napoleon's contemporaries. It was coined in 1926, 68 years after Napoleon died. By that point, the height myth was so thoroughly embedded in Western culture that a 20th century psychologist used it as the foundation for a behavioral theory, without ever verifying whether Napoleon was actually short. The diagnosis was built on the caricature, not on the autopsy record, not on the eyewitness accounts, not on the French unit conversion, on Gillray's cartoon, on a wartime propaganda image created by a man who was paid, directly or indirectly, by a government that needed its enemy to seem small. And that theory, that unverified caricature-derived theory, is now taught in psychology classrooms. It appears in self-help books. It is referenced in boardrooms and therapy sessions and casual conversations about ambition and insecurity. 200 years later. The war is long over. The empire is gone. Napoleon himself has been dust for 2 centuries. But Gillray's cartoon is still winning. The lie is over, but the consequences are not. Consider what it means that we got this wrong. Not a minor detail. Not a footnote buried in an academic journal that nobody reads. The defining physical characteristic of one of the most studied, most analyzed, most documented human beings in the last 500 years. A man about whom more books have been written than almost any other figure in Western history. A man whose life has been examined by generations of historians, biographers, military strategists, and psychologists. And the most basic fact, how tall he was wrong. For 200 years. Nobody questioned this. For over 100 years, nobody questioned this. That is not a small failure. That is a systemic one. And it tells us something deeply uncomfortable about how history actually works. Not in the archives, not in the careful work of serious scholars, but in the version that reaches most people. The version that travels. The version that sticks. History, at the popular level, does not move by evidence. It moves by image. Gillray understood this in 1803. He understood that a single compelling visual, repeated enough, shared enough, laughed at enough, could override any amount of documentary record. He understood that the human mind does not fact-check what it finds funny. It simply files it, labels it, and retrieves it decades later as settled truth. That mechanism has not changed. On the surface, it makes sense. But surfaces are rarely the whole story. Think about the infrastructure that sustained this myth across 2 centuries. It was not sustained by malice alone. Malice fades when the war ends. It was sustained by repetition. By every comedian who reached for the easy joke. by every textbook that included the height as biographical color without checking the unit conversion, by every psychologist who named a complex after a caricature without reading an autopsy report, by every bobblehead and costume and Halloween joke that kept the image alive long after the propaganda that created it had been forgotten. The myth became self-sustaining. It no longer needed Gillray. It no longer needed the British Foreign Office. It had been adopted, enthusiastically, cheerfully, globally, by a culture that had no idea it was still fighting a war that ended in 1815. And here is where this stops being about Napoleon, because the mechanism Gillray used, reduce the target, make them ridiculous, attach the ridicule to something physical and therefore immutable, is not a relic of 19th century British propaganda. It is the operating manual of every modern political attack campaign ever run. It is the logic behind every viral meme designed to delegitimize a public figure. It is the architecture of every culture war fought through image and mockery rather than argument and evidence. What happened next was not an accident. When you make someone laughable, you make their ideas dismissible. You do not have to engage with what they built, or what they argued, or what they got right. You just have to make sure that every time their name comes up, the first thing the audience sees, even subconsciously, is the cartoon, the caricature, the small, furious man in the oversized hat. Napoleon reformed the legal systems of half of Europe. The Napoleonic Code influenced the constitutions of more than 70 countries. It is the foundation of civil law in Louisiana, in Quebec, in large parts of Latin America and Africa. The man reshaped the legal architecture of the modern world. But the bobblehead is funnier. And that asymmetry between what a person actually did and what image of them survives is not unique to Napoleon. It is the standard outcome when propaganda is more compelling than the historical record, when the caricature is more portable than the biography. Smithsonian Magazine noted that the Napoleon height myth remains one of the most persistent historical misconceptions in Western culture, not despite the availability of corrective information, but alongside it. The autopsy record is public. The unit conversion is simple arithmetic. The eyewitness accounts are translated and accessible. None of that has meaningfully dented the myth, because the myth was never really about Napoleon's height. It was about making you feel like you already knew him. The irony is almost too obvious. Almost. A man who spent his entire career fighting to be taken seriously by the crowned heads of Europe, to be seen as a legitimate ruler rather than a Corsican upstart, was ultimately defeated not at Waterloo, not at the hands of Wellington or Blücher, but by a cartoonist in London who drew him small. And we have been repeating that cartoonist's punchline ever since, without knowing his name, without knowing his paymaster, without knowing that the joke was never ours to begin with. We inherited a lie, and we made it our own. That is worth thinking about. There is a question worth sitting with before we leave this story. Not about Napoleon specifically. Not about Gillray, or the British Foreign Office, or the French unit of measurement that nobody bothered to convert correctly. Those are details. Important details, but details nonetheless. The question is larger than that. How many times have you repeated something you never verified? Not out of malice, not out of ignorance in any blameworthy sense, simply because it arrived pre-packaged, pre-labeled, culturally endorsed, and repeating it felt like participating in shared knowledge rather than spreading an unexamined claim. We all have. Every single one of us. That is not an accusation. It is an observation about how knowledge actually travels between human beings. Most of what we know, we did not discover. We received. And the people who handed it to us received it from someone else. And somewhere near the beginning of that chain, sometimes centuries back, sometimes decades, sometimes just years, There was a moment when the thing being passed along was not fact, but fiction. Not evidence, but image. Not history, but propaganda wearing history's clothes. On the surface, it makes sense. But surfaces are rarely the whole story. Napoleon's height is almost a perfect case study in how this works, precisely because it is so trivial. Nobody's life depends on whether Napoleon was 5 feet 2 or 5 feet 7. No policy hangs on it. No election turns on it. It is, in the grand scheme of things, a harmless misconception about a dead man's physical measurements. And yet, it persisted, perfectly intact, for 200 years, which means the mechanism works even when the stakes are low. Even when nobody is trying particularly hard to protect the myth. Even when the corrective information is freely available, clearly documented, and requires nothing more than a basic unit conversion to verify. If it works that well on something that small, imagine what it does on something that matters. Now here is the part that changes the entire picture. The same architecture that built the Napoleon myth, reduce, ridicule, repeat, is running right now. On figures you follow. On movements you support or oppose. On events you think you understand because you have seen enough images and heard enough jokes and absorbed enough cultural shorthand to feel certain. Certainty is not the same as knowledge. James Gillray knew that. He built a career on the gap between the two. He understood that certainty, the comfortable, unexamined kind, is the easiest thing in the world to manufacture. You do not need truth. You need repetition. You need an image simple enough to remember and funny enough to share. You need the joke to travel faster than the correction. He was working with pen and ink in 1803. Consider what he could do today. The irony is almost too obvious. Almost. Because we live in an era of unprecedented access to primary sources. The autopsy record, the eyewitness accounts, the unit conversion, all of it available in seconds on a device in your pocket. We have more corrective information at our fingertips than any generation in human history. And the Napoleon bobblehead is still on the shelf. That is not a failure of information. It is a failure of the questions we think to ask. We have been trained, by education, by media, by the sheer velocity of modern information, to consume rather than interrogate, to receive rather than verify, to feel informed rather than to actually be informed. The difference between those two things is where propaganda lives. Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the greatest army his era had ever seen. He reformed the law of civilizations. He was exiled twice, escaped once, and spent his final years on a rock in the South Atlantic writing his memoirs, still trying, even in defeat, to control the narrative of his own life. He failed at that last part. Gillray won. But knowing that Gillray won, knowing the mechanism, seeing the architecture, understanding that the joke was a weapon before it was a punchline, that changes something. Not everything, but something. Because the first step to not being manipulated by an image is knowing that the image was made. If history got Napoleon this wrong, this completely, this durably, on something this simple, what else are we still getting wrong? What other certainties are we carrying that were handed to us by someone with an interest in how we see the world? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. Next week, we uncover the truth about the people history painted as savage, and why everything you think you know about the Vikings was written by the people who feared them most. Remember the feeling you have right now. That slight discomfort. That small crack in something you thought was solid. That is what real history feels like. If you made it this far, you already see Napoleon differently. Remember that feeling.